welcome everyone. Today is the last Tree ID course for the Naturalist Hour series, our fourth one of June. As Diane said, my name is Bradley Simpson, ANS's Restoration Fellow, and if you haven't guessed it already, I love trees. Even so, like this picture right up here of one of our species today was taken by me. And we have lots of really beautiful flowers and shrubs and understory trees that we'll be talking about today. These trees are very important for habitat and food for our native wildlife, and though they are smaller than our magnificent canopy trees, they may be just as important or even more important. Because we have some returners and some new, again, all the information from the previous three Tree ID courses will be included in this one. We will obviously not touch on information repeated too in depth. We will mention only those terms and characteristics that really apply to today's species. If you feel that I have not touched on something enough, don't worry. The presentation will be shared with you after, as well as the recording. But with that, we will get started. Again, if you have a question, I will have natural breaks between subtopics for people to chime in and ask a question. If you have an immediate question that you want to put in so you don't forget, just put in the chat. And like I said, Christian will read those during those break points. All right. So we are going to focus on 4 understory trees and shrubs. Our Downy serviceberry, which is an understory tree in the rose family. Our roses the rose family comprise 2,500 species, most generally characterized by their 5-petaled flowers. We'll focus on spice bush, the laurel, which is in the laurel family. Surprisingly enough, this family actually has more species than the rose family, with 2,850 species. You might recognize one tree that's also in this family, that is sassafras. We will also focus on flowering dogwood, a nice understory tree in the dogwood family. And we'll take a look on how that dogwood compares with some other native dogwoods, which are actually more shrubby than the flowering dogwood. And then in our viburnum, our Adoxaceae family, which also includes elderberries, we'll focus on our arrowwood, our Viburnum dentatum, and also look at some 2 other native viburnums, as well as a very invasive double file viburnum. I forgot to mention also in the dogwood, we're going to look at Kusa dogwood, which is a Japanese dogwood variety that is popularly planted, and there are actually a few at Woodend. So with that, we will go right in and remind ourselves of how we identify trees. Like in the last 3, we used a plant sample with a key to identify it. And today we're going to move way up in key complexity using the Flora of Virginia. This book is a comprehensive key that includes all of the native and some naturalized plant species in Virginia. This book is obviously very specific to Virginia, but includes a lot of species, most of the species that you would also see in Maryland. If you are in Maryland and wanted a more comprehensive key, you would have to kind of get the Flora of Virginia as well as the book Flora of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, Maryland has not had an updated flora since 1984, and those books are very difficult to find. The key in the Flora of Virginia is very complicated. In our last talk, we used a key that started out with the key to genera, or the genus. So for example, the genus for arrowwood would be Viburnum, with the species being dentatum. Today, our key will start way out into the families, which would be for Viburnum, the Adoxaceae, which then has multiple genera within that. So it's a very complicated key, but I chose a species that would be at least a little bit easier to follow while going through the key. But obviously there are much simpler ones like the Tree Finder, which is a great one to start out with, and then apps like the Virginia Tech Dendrology and iNaturalist are also very helpful. So the Flora of Virginia, like I said, includes some naturalized species, mostly native though. So if you wanted to have a key that is more comprehensive with the plants that you're going to come across in an urban or a suburban area, I would suggest, I'll have to fix this before I send it out. I have this hand lens picture blocking out one of the titles. I will fix that before sending it out. But if you want to have a more comprehensive keys, I would suggest using the Muncher's Key to Woody Plants, which says it has cultivated species, but really only woody. And then if you want to have some more herbaceous species as well, the Plant Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas, the book pictured here to the right, is very, very helpful. As we've mentioned in the past, there are lots of very specific botanical terminology. If you are going to use a book like Flora of Virginia, the terminology gets very complex and difficult. I would highly suggest, if you're using that key, to purchase the Plant Identification Terminology book, which has basically any complicated term that you would come across in the Flora of Virginia. I'll highlight some of these terms as they come up with the species characteristics. So like I said, we are focusing on understory trees and shrubs today. So first off, what is an understory? It's really the vegetation growing under the mature canopy trees, those really tall, almost 60 feet plus tall trees. The understory includes specialist species like herbaceous plants, shrubs, and small trees like our flowering dogwood, but it also includes the seedlings and saplings of canopy trees, the babies and teenagers of the trees that once they are mature will create that nice dense canopy for these understory trees to thrive in. So what is really the main difference between a canopy tree and the understory tree? And that's really how it is able to reach its mature height. A canopy tree really needs to lay in wait in the shade until there is a large amount of sunlight that allows it to grow quickly up into the canopy, while an understory tree thrives in the shade and can reach full mature height without large amounts of sunlight. So that's really the big difference here, is how much sunlight it takes for this tree to reach a mature height. An understory tree usually will not reach heights above 25 feet, whereas a canopy tree can grow up over 100 feet when that sunlight is available. So pictured here, I've got a sapling of a red oak, a mature post oak that had the sunlight to reach all the way up in the canopy, and then a picture of some pawpaws, which are some nice understory trees that really like to stay in that shade and aren't really worried about getting into the canopy. So in the understory, we have one big pest that really influences it. Last time I talked about some insects and fungi that really influence our canopy trees, but there is a much larger fuzzy animal that can really be detrimental to our understory, and that is our deer. So this was a picture taken at Woodend prior to the deer exclusion fence that really shows the absence of an understory. And as we know, a forest is not just the mature trees in the canopy. The understory trees are really important in providing a nice habitat and food for our native wildlife. They create a lot of great hiding spots for nesting birds and some wonderfully delicious berries as well. Even though we are going to be using a more complicated key, I always want to reiterate the importance of looking at alternate versus opposite arrangement. Even in the complicated key, this is still one of the first characteristics that you look at when identifying a plant. So in Flora, Virginia, it is, I think, only the fifth decision that you make is determining whether it's alternate or opposite. So again, a very important characteristic in plants is the arrangement of the leaves. We are going to be talking about some two oppositely arranged plant groups today, our dogwoods and viburnums, and we'll take a look on how these kind of differ between each other. Our viburnums and dogwoods are quite similar. They both have the same fruit type, but viburnums are really classified by having toothed leaves, whereas dogwoods are very, very smooth or entire along the edge. But these species are commonly found together. So in our twigs, we always want to, again, look for our alternate versus opposite. So the position of the buds and the leaf scar. So our leaf scar is just the remnant of what is the remnant of when a leaf was there. And our buds are usually placed on top. And then we're also going to look at our position of our buds, our terminal versus axillary. Today we're going to get some good examples of how our flower and leaf buds differ, especially in regards to the position along a stem. And a reminder of just what axillary is, it just means in the axil, and then a terminal or apical is just at the end. So an axil, again, is just an angle between two parts. It's always just a good reminder because axil is just kind of a weird term to use. It's really just the space between two features. So we most generally talk about the axil of a leaf or the axil of veins on a leaf. So between the primary and secondary veins, usually referring to the hairs between them. And for the leaf and stem, we are usually referring to the bud features. So again, our flower bud versus leaf bud, just kind of a reminder of how they differ. Our flower buds are very conspicuous. They hold a lot in there, a lot of complicated features, such as just the inflorescence, the female and sometimes also the male reproductive structures for a flower. Whereas the leaf buds are much less significant, usually more pointed, whereas the flower buds are rounded. And sometimes we'll see an example of this today as well. The flowers and leaves can be in the same bud, but this would usually be in the terminal bud. So we'll see an example of that with our serviceberry. All right. So here's our serviceberry, our Amelanchier arborea. So arborea really just refers to tree-like. So it is so this serviceberry is a single-stemmed, most generally single-stemmed, looking like a tree, but again, not reaching full mature height. Whereas some of our other serviceberries are more shrubby, having multi-stems and not reaching as tall as our Downy serviceberry. Before its twigs, its leaf scars are arranged alternately along the stem. The buds are arranged singly along the stem, and sometimes they even exist on spur shoots. So spur shoots are these small protuberances along the stem where each line indicates 1 year of growth. So it only extends just a little bit each year, and a bud is only going to exist at the end of that spur shoot. If there is a spur shoot, there will be no axillary buds, because a spur shoot always has buds at the end. The buds are 5 to 6 scaled. They're very long, 4 times as long as thick. They lie close to the twig, as we see here, like almost being pushed up against the twig, in a very reddish stem, and we get to see these tiny white lenticels as well. So you can kind of guess the age of this stem by just counting these little lines on the spur shoot, and that just gives a good indication of how old your plant is. In flowering dogwood, we have very, very different buds, our vegetative and flower buds. The leaf scars here are arranged opposite of each other, and each pair of leaf scars are connected by a line encircling the twig, and we can see that line here. Around here, it goes all around the twig, which is a very characteristic feature of the flowering dogwood. The color is also very indicative, very purplish. I think the most striking feature is just that onion-shaped flower bud that sits at the ends of these twigs that are curved upwards towards the sky. And then our vegetative buds are also terminal. It's interesting that axillary buds in dogwood are not very conspicuous at all. Very hard to see in any of these pictures, only really at the terminus. But those flower and vegetative buds are very distinct, and this is also a common feature in our dogwoods. For our arrowwood viburnum or viburnum dentatum, we have some very smooth or hairy twigs, but the really big feature to look at here is how angled they are. You can kind of see it along the side here, how it creates a distinct angle along the stem, whereas usually stems are very distinctly circular or rounded. This one, if you were to roll the stem between your fingers, you would actually feel that angle, very common in viburnums. The buds are only a 1/4 inch long, usually brown with several scales, and then you can see some hairiness. And then these twigs also have these raised orange lenticels, those gas exchange pores, along the bark as well. So in the viburnum, our buds are not very distinct between flower and leaf buds, but in our spice bush, just like our flowering dogwood, those flower and leaf buds are very distinct between each other. The twigs are a nice light gray to brown, or as you see, are more greenish brown. They have a very apparent white dotted lenticels that are raised, and you can feel that texture when you are feeling the stem. You can feel those raised lenticels. The flower buds are very green and globose, so just very spherical, very conspicuous, whereas those leaf buds are more brownish. They're stout, so really, really small and fatter towards the stem, and much more inconspicuous when compared to our flower buds. So with that, I will take a quick pause and see if there are any questions so far before moving on to more of our bark characteristics.
We had a question about flowering dogwoods, and this person was wondering when those flower buds would appear.
So the flower buds are going to appear kind of later in the season after the fruit has fallen off. So I would say like late fall, early winter, you'll start to really notice those flower buds. They kind of form towards the end of the growing season, just getting ready for the next year. And those flower buds are going to open usually before the leaf buds open. So you'll see kind of more the white flower before you'll see the green leaves. And then as the leaves come out, that white flower becomes even more conspicuous with the green leaves as the backdrop.
And for all the shrubs that you're talking about today, do they all lose their leaves in the fall?
For all the shrubs I'm talking about today, yes, they do lose their leaves in the fall. If we were to talk more about hollies, then we would have more evergreen shrubs. But I would say most generally the shrub species that you'll find in the forest are going to be deciduous, other than the hollies, and sometimes are like eastern red cedar, which is an understory tree as well.
Great. That's all the questions for right now.
All right. I do want to mention that there's some things that I even learned with this presentation, and it'll be referred to with our flowering dogwood in the flowers. I think it's going to be very interesting, so hold tight for that. But for now, we'll discuss our bark. So today, our species really have visible lenticels, but kind of different than what we are accustomed to seeing in a cherry. Those cherries, like we see here, have these very distinctive horizontal lenticels. But today, our lenticels are more like raised dots along the stem, which are going to be apparent in our viburnum and spice bush. Our bark today for our serviceberry is going to be most generally smooth, but once in maturity, we'll start to you'll start to see vertical cracks and seams in the smooth bark, kind of these vertical dark lines. We'll also look at kind of plated bark with our flowering dogwood, which is pictured right here. You can see these very distinctive plates that are formed. And then when the flowering dogwood is younger, it kind of is more scaly, but still kind of in the similar shape to these plates, because those scales will become these plates as the tree matures. And we'll see that once we get to our flowering dogwood slide here in a second. And ridges and furrows, I mean, this is more commonly seen in our canopy trees. We will not be, our species today do not have ridged and furrowed bark, but it's always a good reminder that there are lots of different types of bark. and it is usually a very striking feature that can be used to identify trees, especially in the winter. So a reminder to, if you are wanting to identify trees in the winter, the Bark Book, A Guide to Northeast Species, is a very, very useful book. As sometimes we'll not have some species in Maryland because it is a more northern species book. So for example, persimmon, which is more southernly distributed, is not going to be included in that book, but it still is very comprehensive. And it also includes a key. So for our Downy Serviceberry, our bark is really smooth, kind of showing some dark lines that will, when mature, will create these vertical seams and cracks. And as a mature tree, it reaches about 15 to 25 feet in height. Definitely not what I would describe as a canopy tree, but still taller than what you would expect from a shrub. Our flowering dogwood, like I said, when it's younger, has these small square scales that, as it matures, forms these very distinctive thick plates. And it's very, very reddish. It's a distinct color. Even when you take a scale or a plate off, you'll still see reddish inner bark. So that red color is a very distinctive feature in our flowering dogwood as well. Our arrowwood viburnum is a lot smoother. It's really gray to light brown, and it has these raised orange lenticels along the bark as well that we can see here and kind of see in our more gray bark or more brownish bark here. So very orange lenticels, which is different from our spice bush, which has very white lenticels. The bark is brown to gray brown, and sometimes can be a greenish brown. And those lenticels are even, I would say, more raised than that of our viburnum, creating a very unique texture when you run your hand down the bark. Very, very unique. That is very characteristic of spice bush. And obviously, if you were to take your nail and scrape off a little bit of the bark and give it a good smell, you'll smell that very characteristic spicy aroma that gives the spice bush its name. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions regarding bark before we move on to more of our leaf features. All right. If there are no...
Oh, sorry. One just came through. This one is asking about the cherry bark and why it looked so different. So there were two photos of cherry bark, and one of them looked different.
Yes. So that is... So we have the black cherry here. So it is it's our native cherry, and when it's younger, it has that horizontal lenticels that we see here. But as it matures, it creates this very scaled pattern, kind of what a lot of people refer to as like a burnt potato chip pattern. It is a very helpful feature when distinguishing between native and non-native cherries. Non-native cherries will not become scaled with maturity, whereas our non-native ones will continue to have this very more smooth bark with these apparent horizontal lenticels. So this would be a non-native cherry bark, and this would be our native black cherry bark. And remember that when younger, our black cherry still is gray in terms of bark color, but also consists of those horizontal lenticels. So when it's younger, a little bit more difficult to tell the non-native and native apart. One feature that you can look at are native black cherries. On the underside of the leaf, they have these orange hairs along the mid vein, that primary vein. And our non-native cherries do not have this feature. So that's really the difference between those.
And do you have examples of some non-native cherries, since we're talking about those?
Examples of non-native cherries would be the ones that you would see for the cherry blossoms, the cherry blossom festivals. I mean, all of those are the Japanese cherries, Yoshino cherries. So if you're in DC and you see a cherry tree, it's going to be a non-native cherry. There are a few at Woodend, and again, you'll notice them. Some of the species are invasive, like the sweet cherry. And you'll find those in some forests because there'll be mature trees with that smooth bark and those horizontal lenticels.
And for dogwoods, and we know we can identify dogwood because of its bark, but when does dogwood bark mature?
So the dogwood bark will become pretty distinctive even at, I would say it would take a few years for it to become distinctive. Later in the presentation, I will have more features to look at for differentiating the different dogwood species. So we'll get to that later.
All right, that's it for now.
All right. So again, with our leaf anatomy, we could have simple or compound leaves. And again, this is really dependent on the position of the bud along the leaf. In a compound leaf, the bud only exists down here at the end of the leaf stem and the woody stem, with no buds being apparent between the leaf stem and the leaflets. And the simple leaf, again, only has the one bud and the one blade along the woody stem. All of our species today have simple leaves. We won't be getting into compound leaves today. For shape and arrangement, we've been kind of focusing on very similarly shaped leaves, and these are just because these leaf shapes are quite common when looking at plants. So today we're, again, focused on ovate, which is very egg-shaped, obovate, the opposite of egg-shaped, and elliptic, very oval shape, with more so the fatter being in the middle of the leaf rather than either at the end or the apex or at the base of the leaf. In regards to our leaf bases and apex, we're really focusing on rounded cuneate and cordate bases, so very rounded, just kind of coming to a very rounded base, almost very symmetrical. Cuneate, which is just tapering narrowly to a narrowly triangular acute shape. And then our cordate, which is heart-shaped. We'll see that in our serviceberry. And for our leaf apex, we've most generally been talking about acute and acuminate, but today we'll see very rounded leaf apices as well. So for venation and margin, we'll be seeing some really interesting venation today as it refers to our dogwood. We'll have very arcuate venation, so the secondary veins curve towards the tip of the leaf, towards the apex of the leaf. And sometimes it's described as somewhat parallel too, because as those veins curve towards the tip, they become parallel to each other. In regards to our margin, there's not many things new for today. We will talk about ciliate margins when it refers to spicebush, or just fine hairs along the margin that really can only be seen with a hand lens. And then in dogwood, we'll be talking about an undulate margin, which is very wavy, and it creates a very distinctive 3D shape. So again, I have this slide in here because it's been in our other ones. Now, the sun and shade leaves are very apparent in our canopy trees, where there is very strong differences in the amount of sunlight each leaf is receiving. Because understory trees are in the shade, primarily they don't really have sun versus shade leaves. But again, it's always a good reminder that this can be very apparent in our canopy trees. So for our serviceberry leaves, they again are alternate and simple. The leaf margin is serrulate, so these very small serrations along the margin of the leaf. The serrations, remember, are different than dentations because a serrate leaf will have those teeth being pointed towards the apex of the leaf, whereas dentate really just points straight out. Our leaf shape is elliptic to obovate, so opposite of egg-shaped. Has rounded or this like really cordate leaf base, and more rarely being a triangular cuneate at the base. Our leaf apex is acute to acuminate, so either being triangular or almost pinched to the tip. I'm sorry, just having to plug in my computer real quick. The leaf surfaces are very smooth on either side, and a big characteristics for differentiating it between other serviceberries are the hairs present on the petiole, so the leaf stem. And I'll remind you of that when we compare this with our Shadlow serviceberry, our Amelanchier canadensis, which does not have pubescent petioles. When young, these species can look very similar, but the growth form, again, we'll talk about that later, is another characteristic feature to tell those two species apart. For a flowering dogwood, our leaves are opposite and simple. The leaf shape is ovate, so egg-shaped, or widely elliptic, so being very wide in the middle, and can sometimes also be obovate, opposite of egg-shaped. The margin is entire, so very smooth, no serrations or lobing, but they are very undulate. So you get this very wavy margin, creating this really distinctive and interesting 3D shape to our leaves. The leaf base is tapering or cuneate to rounded with a pointed apex, and these 4 to 6 arcuate veins. We can kind of see them arc up towards the tip. So 4 to 6 on each side, so 4 to 6 pairs. And the leaves are very smooth and can be somewhat pubescent above and beneath, but generally very smooth. Our arrowwood viburnum leaves, so Viburnum dentatum. So this species name actually really helps you identify the species, because the dentatum refers to its dentate leaves, the leaves having dentations along the margin. They are opposite and simple as well. Sometimes they can be coarsely serrate, so we can kind of see here how these dentations kind of point towards the tip. But most generally, they are distinctly dentate with rounded bases, or right here we see a cordate base, the apex being acute to acuminate. Usually glabrous above, but can sometimes be slightly hairy. And then below, they actually have this interesting pubescence called stellate pubescence. And stellate just refers to kind of a star shape. The hairs are born in one single point and then branch off from that point. And those stellate hairs are, there are multiple of those stellate hairs along the underside of the leaf. So it really just refers to a star-shaped pattern. Obviously, this would be another feature that you would need a hand lens to see. Our spicebush leaves are alternate and, like all the others, are simple. These shapes can kind of vary, but are really oblong, so kind of like stretched out at the end. The leaf base is very cuneate, very triangular, with a distinctly acuminate tip, so the pinch to the tip. The leaf margin is entire, so smooth, but once you take a look with your hand lens, you can see that those fine hairs along them, or that cilia. It is glabrous, but also sometimes hairy beneath, but the really distinctive features, if you were to crush them up and smell them, very aromatic, giving that spicy aroma. And then another feature is that its distal leaves, so the leaves furthest from the origin of the stem, are a lot larger than the proximal leaves, or the leaves closest to the stem. So you can kind of see here that this leaf really close to the origin of this stem, or as close to the main stem, it's very small, and the further away you get, the larger the leaves get. Another distinctive feature of spicebush, along with its very textured white lenticels. So that does it for our leaf characteristics. I'll see if there's any questions now before moving on to flowers.
Could you go back to the dogwood vein picture? This person was wondering how you could tell the difference between the acute veins and pinnate veins.
So this is a pinnate venation. So it's an arcuate vein is a type of pinnate venation, because there's still one main vein with secondary veins branching off that vein. Similar to that of a feather. But in these species, the dogwoods, they also have an arcuate shape to them. So it's really just a feature within a pinnately veined leaf.
Great. I don't see any other questions right now.
All right, so we will move on to flowers. So like we mentioned before, there are lots of inflorescences or arrangements the flowers can take. Today we're really focusing on a corum, which is over here and refers to viburnum. So a corum is really a flower cluster cluster whose lower stalks, these lower ones, are proportionally larger so that the flowers form this flat to convex head. Our Arrowwood viburnum is a corum, but sometimes you can differentiate the viburnums because some of our other natives, like actually all the other three species we're talking about today are actually have a cyme inflorescence where each of the flower parts are born from one single point and branching off of that. Our dogwood is a head, so actually the flower parts only exist right here. The male and female flower parts only exist right in the center of a dogwood. And these petals are only there for attraction to pollinators to come into this flower head. And our serviceberry has a raceme, which is a spike with these pedicels. So a pedicel, like a leaf stem or petiole, a pedicel is a flower stem. So this is the flower stem, and the flower would be born right here at the top. I'll get into this very interesting petals because dogwood actually does not have petals, but we'll talk about that in a second. So for flowers, we can have perfect flowers, again, with their male and female parts. Most of our flowers today are perfect, except for spicebush, because they actually are dioecious, which again, I will mention on the next, or say a reminder of what that is on the next slide. But here I added actually a new diagram for parts of a flower, and I wanted to point out what a bract is. A bract is a modified leaf part, not really a flower structure, but it is used to support the inflorescence and sometimes attract pollinators. So this bract can be very leafy and kind of inconspicuous or wildly showy, as in our dogwood. So again, I just want to quickly mention the difference between monoecious and dioecious. Monoecious means that the both male and female parts are on the same plant individual, or dioecious means that there are separate male and female plant individuals, meaning that both male and female plant individuals are needed to make a fruit, which are only apparent on the female plant individuals. So for our flowers, like I said, the dogwood is very interesting. These 4 petals are not actually petals. These are bracts. So these 4 showy things are modified leaf parts rather than actually being technically a part of the flower. But because of their color and their showiness, they do attract pollinators to the reproductive structures in the middle of those bracts, which is actually the flower head. And our serviceberry, it actually has petals and 5 Maris petals, so these are not modified leaf parts, and it actually is a flower structure. And like I said, are born on racemes, so they have pedicels and little flower stems. For our spicebush, our female and male spicebush have yellow flowers, but again, there are separate male and female plant individuals. So you'll have some. So here we have male flowers because they have stamens up here, the male reproductive parts, and then our female flowers will be lacking those stamens. And our viburnum flowers are very white and born in, like I said, in those flat top corums, and they can be up to 4 inches in diameter and are generally pollinated by insects. This is a picture I took of a little insect walking through, getting some nectar, and will most likely pollinate that viburnum. Even though a viburnum is monoecious, having both female and male flower parts in one individual, they need separate individuals to create fruit. They do not self-pollinate. They need multiple individuals or cross-pollination to bear fruit. So that is our flowers for today. I'll see if there's any questions before moving on to fruit. All right, if there are no questions, we'll go to fruit. So in the past, we've talked about a lot of very dry fruits when relating to acorns, hickory nuts, our samaras, which are achenes. But today we're really talking about some fleshy fruits. So our 2 species either have drupes or a pome. So only the serviceberry has a pome, so like an apple, and all the others are drupes. And really the main difference between the 2 is a drupe has this very hard stony pit in the center that protects the seed, whereas a pome does not have that very hard stony pit with the seed in it. It is very fleshy all the way until you reach a seed, very similar to the apple. So if you were to eat a drupe, you would really notice that hard pit that you would reach while chewing it, whereas a pome, you could reach the seed really without even almost knowing. So like I said, our serviceberry is a pome. They are dark purple to red and edible in June. So sometimes you'll hear these plants called Juneberry because that's when the berries ripen. And like I said, the Amelanchier canadensis is called shadlow serviceberry. These bushes were also called shad bushes because of the timing of ripening of the fruits and the time of peak shad migration where you would go and fish for shad. So that's why we also hear them called shad bush. Very, very delicious. The trick is getting them before the birds, especially the cedar waxwings. So the flowering dogwood fruit is a dark to bright red drupe present in the summer. So right now they're in development and are small and green. So you can actually see here, this is late in the summer and you can see the flower buds for next year starting to form. So that will, I know there was a question about that recently. So our spice bush fruit is short stalked, usually in the axils of our leaves. They're shiny, they will become red. So this is one in development. So it starts out green and it contains a single seed. And our viburnum flowers are followed by these really blue-black drupes that ripen in early fall. And this is a very distinctive feature for our native viburnums. If you see a viburnum with a red drupe, it is most likely non-native. And I'll get to that when we talk about our double flower viburnum. But before we do a comparison with some similar species, I want to see if there's any questions regarding our fruits. All right, we'll get right into our comparisons. So there are lots of dogwoods that we could find throughout our region. Flowering dogwood is really the only one that is a tree. So a single-stemmed understory tree that is usually not multi-stem, having more than one stem at the base. Our other dogwoods are very shrubby, most generally having multiple stems coming from the base. But when young, it is kind of more difficult to differentiate the two species. The flowering dogwood has generally 5 to 6 pairs of those secondary veins. So the veins present coming off of the primary vein, whereas our other species have less than 5 or 6. They usually have 3 or 4 pairs. So 3 to 4 veins on each side, the secondary veins. Our silky dogwood, as you can see kind of here and a little bit right here, their stems are very purplish, becoming kind of olive or gray later and being very smooth. Our gray dogwood has obviously kind of a more grayish bark, not really generally being too purple, and then also having pretty gray undersides, which is present because of the pubescence on the underside of the leaf. For our red osier dogwood, as it says in the name, very red. The stems all throughout maturity, so even the mature and the young stems are going to be very distinctly red with those white lenticels that you can see there. So there's actually some dogwoods that break the rule. So dogwoods are more generally opposite leaved, but there's one dogwood species that is alternate leaved. So it aptly got the name alternate leaf dogwood, and even in its Latin name, Cornus alternifolia, it really tells you that it is alternate leaved. So really that's the big difference. If you find a dogwood and the leaves are not opposite, it's an alternate leaf dogwood. And then a non-native dogwood that you'll see commonly landscaped is our Kusa dogwood. So those flower bracts, the white modified leaf parts, are more pointed than they are in flowering dogwood, but the more striking feature is that the dark actually is what we call exfoliating. So it peels and it shows off this more tan bark that contrasts with its gray outer bark before it peels off. Whereas, again, our flowering dogwood has plated bark that does not exfoliate and reveal a tan color and is reddish throughout in our flowering dogwood. For our viburnums, really the two common ones you'll see here are maple leaf viburnum or blackhaw viburnum. And these species are named, or really for the Latin names, are named as such because of the shape of the leaf. So maple leaf viburnum or Viburnum acerifolium means the leaves look like maples, maple leaves. When they're young, they can actually be kind of hard to differentiate between a young maple and a maple leaf viburnum. But again, if you see a multi-stemmed plant, it is most likely going to be your shrubby maple leaf viburnum. And then for our blackhaw viburnum, which is the common name doesn't really hint at the leaf shape, but it's Latin name Viburnum prunifolium, which means cherry leaf, cherry-like leaves. Has these very cherry-esque leaves because they're very elliptic and have these small serrations along the margin. And as in our other two viburnum species, the bark stays relatively smooth and gray, whereas in our blackhaw viburnum, it actually forms these small plates, much smaller than you would see in flowering dogwood, and again would be multi-stemmed rather than single-stemmed like our flowering dogwood. A non-native viburnum that you will see frequently in our region, there's actually one that still remains planted at Woodend. It's our double file viburnum or Viburnum plicatum. The big difference for these species is that it is very hairy when young, very, very orange hairy. It still has what we refer to as stellate pubescence, so you can kind of make out that the hairs only exist at one point and then they exist singly along the stem or the bud. Another characteristic feature of our non-native viburnums is that they have red berries or drupes. So the red drupes rather than our dark purple or dark blue drupes that we see in our native ones. And the flowers are very showy and very fragrant. And with our serviceberry, like I said, our shadlow serviceberry is the other species of Amelanchier that you would see commonly in our region. The big difference here is that it has these smooth petioles rather than a hairy petiole that we see in our Downy serviceberry. Downy referring usually to hairy, so that's another term that we use for pubescence is the word downy. But another great way to tell these species apart is at maturity, how many stems are there. Our Amelanchier arborea will have one single stem at the base and growing really tall, 15 to 25 feet, whereas our shadlow serviceberry or Amelanchier canadensis has multiple stems coming from the base and being, again, more shrubby, not reaching really anything over 15 feet in height. So before we go into identifying a twig sample with Flora Virginia, I want to see if there's any questions. All right, so we have 10 minutes to get through the Flora Virginia key. Again, very complicated. So we will start with one large key and then move into smaller key subsets. And then finally, we'll decide on the family for our sample. And then we'll turn to the page of that the key for that family exists on, and then we'll do that key. So I think we'll actually be doing 4 keys within this one plant ID. So we'll go ahead and start that. So the first, it really just asks how complicated the plant is. Does it have, is the plant minute, consisting of filaments, not really differentiating into leaves, stems, or roots? Or is our plant more complex with stem, leaves, and roots? Obviously, we have a nice big trunk here with leaves and stems, a very complex plant. So we are not talking about gametophytes, free-living gametophytes. These are very, very small, uncomplex plants. So we'll choose 1B. Then it asks if our plants are floating aquatics or if they are terrestrial. So obviously our plant is not floating in water. It is a trunk coming out of the ground. So our plant is terrestrial. So we'll say 2B here. And then it asks whether or not our plant is woody or herbaceous. So really asks if there is a present of wood structures, so that really stiff woody material, or if it's just very a flexible green herbaceous plant. We have a distinctly woody tree with woody stems, so we're going to select 3A. It is a woody tree, shrub, or vine. And then it asks whether our stems are fleshy and green and have glochidia. So those are the spines that you see on cacti. Our stems are not really green usually. They're brown or gray or tan. So ours are actually gray, and they do not have those glochidia present, so those spines that you would see on cacti. So we know that our plant is not a cactus, so we will move on to 4B. And we'll focus on 5, so number 5. So it asks here if our plant is a rosette shrub or rosette subshrub, so a very, very small shrub, and rosette meaning having lots of leaves coming right out of the base, lots of stems and leaves coming out right above the ground, usually being under 1 decimeter tall or 10 centimeters. Our tree here is much taller than 10 centimeters, and it is definitely a tree. So we'll say that it's 5B. And we'll go on to number 7. So I had to combine here because it switches page during couplet number 7. So now we're looking at whether our tree is evergreen, having leaves that are stiff, needle, or scale-like, or if the leaves are generally not stiff and having well-developed blades and having a mid-vein with secondary and sometimes tertiary veins. So our species here has well-developed blades with a mid-vein and secondary venation, despite there not being very apparent. Tertiary venation will still choose 7B. And then, like I said, we've only made a few decisions just to get rid of some other types of trees like the cacti and the floating aquatics, but now we are on to whether or not our plant is alternate or opposite, a very distinct characteristic and distinctive feature when identifying plants. So because we have 2 leaves being born at one single point, our leaves are opposite. So we'll choose 8B. And then it asks whether our leaves are whorled, so having usually 3 or more leaves at one point, or if they're opposite, only having 2 leaves at one point. Since we only have 2, our leaves are opposite. And because we only have 1 leaf blade with the bud being right here in the middle and no leaflets, our leaves are not compound and are simple. So now we get to move to key J, woody angiosperms with opposite simple leaves. Remember, angiosperms relate to flowering plant species in comparison to our gymnosperms, like our pines that don't really have flowers per se. So now once we move to key J, we have to then decide whether our leaves are palmately or pinnately lobed, or if they are not lobed, our leaf is entire and not having lobes. So we'll choose 1B here. And then it asks if it is serrate or crenate, if it has any sort of teeth along the edge. Because our leaves are smooth along the edge, they are entire. And then it's asking whether really if this is a vine or not. So it's having obvious adaptations for climbing, which would include tendrils, aerial rootlets, or a twining structure or a twining growth form. Because our plant lacks these adaptations, we'll choose 3B. And then we decide whether it is a shrub or tree. Because it is a single stem tree that reaches greater than 15 feet in height, we'll say it's a tree. Now again, a tree versus a shrub is very human defined. Shrubs can get really tall, but the really distinctive feature between a shrub and a tree is how many stems are present at the base of the tree, right when it comes out of the ground. Shrubs will have multiple stems, whereas a tree will have 1. Because we only have 1 stem coming out of the ground here, our plant is a tree. So we'll move to key J5, trees with opposite simple leaves with entire margins. So then it asks if our leaves are evergreen or deciduous. Our leaves are not dark green and thick in texture. They're very thin and smooth, so they are deciduous. So we'll choose 1B. And then it asks about the width of our leaf. So sometimes you really don't have to read the entire thing if you can make a decision based off of the first characteristic. And usually the first characteristic is the most distinctive feature, which is why it is listed first. So because our leaves are less than 7 centimeters wide and not greater than 10 centimeters wide, we know that our plant is in the Cornaceae family, or Cornus genus, the dogwoods. So I move into our final key, the Cornaceae key. And for Flora Virginia, they have these wonderful descriptions for the family and the genus that gives a general detailed description of the features and characteristics present within those plant taxons, whether the family or the genus. The only thing is that they don't always include illustrations of each of the plant, but each species has very, very descriptive, detailed descriptions about what characteristics are present. So for here, it says whether or not our leaves are alternate or opposite. Our leaves are opposite, so now we know that it is not an alternate-leaved dogwood. And then it asks if we have a dwarf shrub that's less than 30 centimeters tall, or a shrub or a tree that is much greater than 30 centimeters tall. Our plant is much taller than that, so we move on to 2B. And then it asks about whether or not there are these showy bracts, those modified leaf parts. Now, it is not the time of year for dogwoods to be in flower. Luckily, I did have a picture. So this is another example of why it's good to have multiple keys on hand. Even our complex Flora Virginia sometimes only refers to certain plant features. So if you did not have the flower here, it would be very difficult to identify your dogwood. But since we have the picture and we have those showy 4 bracts, we now know that it is a flowering dogwood. And here's our resources that I've been using throughout all these presentations. And with that being our last one, I'll take any final questions.
Great. Someone was asking if you could possibly make a guess about a specific shrub that they had seen.
Yeah, sure.
Would be found in Maryland in the fall and the winter, and has very, very bright lavender purple coloring. I know that's not a lot to go on, but do you have any guess based on the color?
Yeah, I can't really say based on the color, though there are a lot of non-native things that are planted that have that kind of color, like or varieties of native plants. There's a variety of eastern redbud that has very purple leaves. Also,
the stem is actually purple.
I really couldn't say right now without looking at the plants. If you send me some pictures on my email, I can do my best.
Yeah. And then this question is about, so these understory plants like spicebush, serviceberry, do they grow in different habitats, like specifically different types of forests, or will you find them?
You'll more generally find all these species coexisting together. They are common in our regional forests. I find spicebush and viburnums growing together with dogwoods and serviceberry. They are very common in our eastern hardwood forests. So you'll find them really anywhere, except for places that get really, really have a lot of water, get really inundated, even though some of these species can be acclimated and adapted for those. But really, you'll find them together in all of our forests.
Great. I think that's it for the questions.
All right.
Thank you, Bradley.
Yeah.
That was wonderful. Thanks, everyone.